Pol Pot, the ruler who tried to reset his country back to year zero. He didn't just want to change his country's government. He wanted to erase the last 100 years of its history entirely, evacuate every city, abolish money, currency, and private property overnight, and start civilization over from what he literally called Year Zero. Roughly a quarter of the entire population died trying to survive what came next. Saloth Sar, who would become known to history under his revolutionary alias Pol Pot, rose through the ranks of Cambodia's communist movement throughout the 1960s and early 1970s, a period during which Cambodia became increasingly destabilized by the broader spillover effects of the Vietnam War, including a devastating American bombing campaign targeting suspected Vietnamese communist supply routes running through Cambodian territory, along with a domestic military coup that further destabilized the country's already fragile political situation, conditions that Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge movement, an extreme communist insurgent group, was ultimately able to exploit, seizing control of the capital city of Phnom Penh in April of 1975. What followed represented one of history's most extreme, rapidly implemented attempts at total societal transformation. Within days of seizing power, Khmer Rouge forces began forcibly evacuating Phnom Penh's entire population, along with the populations of every other Cambodian city, driving millions of people into the countryside under the false pretense of an impending American bombing attack, an evacuation that, whatever specific pretext was initially given, actually reflected the Khmer Rouge's fundamental, ideological commitment to Pol Pot's vision of a purely agrarian, classless society, one requiring the complete elimination of urban populations along with everything Pol Pot associated with corrupting Western and capitalist influence. Pol Pot's regime formally declared the moment of Phnom Penh's fall to represent Year Zero, a deliberate, explicit rejection of Cambodia's entire prior history, framing the Khmer Rouge takeover not as a political transition, but as the literal beginning of an entirely new Cambodian civilization, one intended to be built from complete social and economic scratch, discarding virtually every existing institution, tradition, and social structure the country had previously possessed. The regime's specific policies, implemented with genuinely extreme, uncompromising rigidity, included the complete abolition of currency and private property, the forced relocation of virtually the entire population into rural agricultural labor collectives, the elimination of formal education, religious practice, and most forms of personal property or individual autonomy, and the systematic targeting and execution of anyone identified as representing the educated, urban, or professional classes, the regime viewed as ideologically corrupted beyond redemption, a category that came to include teachers, doctors, former government officials, and, in a genuinely chilling detail, extensively documented by later investigators, individuals whose only apparent offense was wearing eyeglasses, a detail Khmer Rouge cadres reportedly treated as sufficient evidence of educated and therefore suspect social status. The regime's security apparatus, most notoriously centered around a facility in Phnom Penh known as S21, a former school converted into a systematic torture and interrogation center, extracted forced confessions from thousands of detainees before their execution, with meticulous, extensively documented records maintained by the facility's own staff, records that would later provide investigators and historians with genuinely unusual, detailed documentary evidence of the regime's systematic execution program, since the Khmer Rouge's own bureaucratic record-keeping inadvertently preserved detailed evidence of atrocities. Regimes attempting to conceal similar programs have often successfully destroyed. Beyond direct execution, the regime's broader policies produced catastrophic, widespread death through forced labor, starvation, and lack of medical care across the agricultural collectives where the vast majority of Cambodia's displaced urban population had been forcibly relocated, as inexperienced urban populations were forced into intensive agricultural labor, under brutal conditions and unrealistic production quotas, while the regime simultaneously restricted access to food, medical treatment, and basic necessities as both an ideological punishment for perceived class enemies and a practical consequence of the regime's genuinely catastrophic economic mismanagement. The cumulative death toll from Pol Pot's roughly 4 years in power, encompassing direct execution, systematic starvation, forced labor deaths, and denial of medical care, has been estimated by historians and international investigators at somewhere between 1.5 and 2 million people, representing an estimated 20 to 25% of Cambodia's entire population at the time. A death toll proportionally among the most catastrophic of any single political regime in modern history relative to the size of the population it governed. Pol Pot's regime was ultimately overthrown in 1979, not through internal resistance or international intervention specifically targeting the regime's human rights record, but through a Vietnamese military invasion launched primarily in response to escalating border conflicts and Khmer Rouge attacks against Vietnamese territory, a conflict driven substantially by geopolitical and territorial disputes rather than international humanitarian concern, though the invasion's practical effect nonetheless ended the Khmer Rouge's direct governmental control of Cambodia, forcing Pol Pot and remaining Khmer Rouge forces into a prolonged, sustained guerrilla insurgency operating from remote border regions for nearly 2 additional decades. Remarkably, Pol Pot himself was never formally tried or convicted for the atrocities committed under his rule, dying in 1998 while still nominally under Khmer Rouge custody amid internal factional disputes, having never faced formal international prosecution despite the scale of documented atrocities committed under his direct political authority. A genuinely significant gap in international post-Cold War accountability that a subsequent United Nations-backed Cambodian tribunal, established considerably later, ultimately addressed by formally prosecuting several of Pol Pot's surviving senior subordinates instead, since Pol Pot's own death had permanently foreclosed any possibility of his personal formal prosecution. What makes Pol Pot's regime endure as one of history's most extreme examples of ideologically driven mass atrocity isn't simply the staggering proportional scale of the resulting death toll, though that proportional scale remains genuinely among history's most catastrophic, but the specific, uncompromising totality of the regime's underlying ideological vision, an attempt not merely to seize political power, but to completely erase and rebuild an entire nation's economic, social, and cultural existence from a self-declared historical starting point of zero. A vision pursued with such rigid, uncompromising consistency that it ultimately proved catastrophically, fatally incompatible with the basic survival needs of the very population it claimed to be liberating. If stories like this, where an ideology's absolute, uncompromising vision proved more destructive than almost any conventional war could have been, are exactly what you come here for. Subscribe to The Grave Details, because history holds more stories like this than most people will ever know.